Hello to everyone, and welcome to our weekly research seminar. Today, it is our absolute pleasure to welcome Gefjon Off here at Brias. Gefjon is a postdoctoral researcher at Hamburg University. Previously, she was a postdoc at Leuphana University of Lüneburg and a PhD student at Gothenburg University. And her research typically takes a comparative approach to the study of gender and political behavior. And it is also published, if you want to look it up, it is published in various forms, amongst others, a Cambridge Elements and journal articles in various high-impact journals. So today, Gefjon will present ongoing research on the topic of young men and women's gender equality attitudes. So Gefjon, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. It's really cool. It's really nice to be here. I have a cold, and I hope I will survive. I might be coughing in between. I'm really sorry. I'm presenting this paper on young men and young women, and the question on whether we see a divide between the two genders in Gen Z. It is co-authored with Amy Alexander and Nicola Sharon, who are both at the University of Gothenburg. And we have this joint research project funded by the Swedish Research Council, where we look into this question. And so this is one of the outputs of this project. And so basically, this is... Sorry. So this is speaking to the debate on whether young men are really becoming less progressive nowadays or more conservative, or depending on how you want to frame it. And it's a debate that has been quite widespread on the news. And then there are some articles about it now. Most of them are descriptive, and they present quite some cross-country variation. They look at different variables. One looks at left-right ideology. The other one looks at the likelihood to vote for the radical right or the probability to vote item rather than the self-reported vote item. And they come to mostly mixed findings. There are some tendencies in some countries, not in others. So there's no clear answer yet to this question, even though in the media it's been discussed as if it was quite clear, I guess. And so what we try to do with our work is not just to describe what's going on, but also to explain what might be going on, and thereby also make sense of some of those mixed findings. And what we do, in line with our previous work, is that we focus on gender equality attitudes as the variable in which we might see a Gen Z divide or not, which is because we have found that this is the variable where the divide shows most consistently. And so in one of our previous papers, I guess the first one on this, we looked at the item, the one in italic letters, advancing women's and girls' rights has gone too far because it threatens men's and boys' opportunities, and whether people agree with it or not, basically. And here we find that across all European Union countries, in 2020 already, young men here aged between 18 and 29 are most likely to agree with this statement compared to older men and women of any age group. And we thought this was puzzling, so we looked deeper into it. And we found that this was driven especially by young men residing in regions with rising unemployment. So we have this data at the SEP national, regional level, and also young men who consider public institutions as unfair, and especially schools as unfair. So that was one piece that we put out, and another one that came out last year, where we repeated the survey collection of this measure and also other measures in 2023, and we have data then again from all European Union countries. And here we find that young men are particularly opposed to gender quotas in politics, and this is especially young men with lower incomes and education levels. And again, at the regional level, young men residing in regions where women more strongly outperform men in terms of education. So on average, we know that women now do better than men in education, but in some places they do so more strongly than in others. And in those places, we see a stronger opposition among young men to gender quotas in politics. And so This is our previous work that then guides us to what I'm presenting today, and also to the theoretical argument that is basically guiding our line of work. Our overall argument is that young men today are particularly vulnerable to weakening support for gender equality today, partly because of their loss of economic privilege under increasing gender labor market competition. And so what is happening is that women are entering male-dominated labor markets in a sense that labor markets have historically been male-dominated, and especially young women are entering those labor markets, and they are then perceived as a threat to the social norm of male dominance, and perceived, but also to some at least, a realistic threat to individual young men's economic performance. This is the overall theoretical argument, and I'll walk you through it step by step on what it really means and what kind of testable implications come with it. So we argue that it is an age effect and a generational effect. So the age effect means it's about young men around their 20s, mid-20s, maybe up to 30s, but not about older men. So it is an age effect. And it is a generational effect. So it's about today's generation of young men and not about previous generations of young men. We do not think that it is a period effect, which means not all men of all age groups. And we don't think it's a general backlash. So we don't think that these young men are opposing all kinds of perhaps feminist or progressive attitudes, but specific ones. So about the age effect, why do we think it is young men and not older men? It is young women who are now outperforming young men in education, but not in labor force participation. I don't think there's any country, or maybe one or two, I don't know, but in most countries, women do not outperform men in labor market participation, but they do in education. And in education matters most in the early career. So this one area where women are outperforming men matters once they come into the entry-level job market. But afterwards, it won't matter as much anymore, because then your career is influenced also by a lot of other factors. Also, afterwards, there will be a glass ceiling effect for those who compete for leading positions, and there will be a motherhood penalty for those who have children. And so these structural discrimination ways, I guess, are weaker in the entry-level job market, and gender competition is fairer in the entry-level job market. But later on, they kick in. And so it is in that age period, men in their 20s, young men and women in their 20s, around at least their 20s, mid-20s, that we expect that this gender competition is perceived strongest. So why today's and not previous young generations? Why the generational effect? It is because, in our argument, women now consistently outperform men in education. And now, admittedly, they have done so for longer in some countries and more recently in other countries, but it is a consistent trend now. And here, this is data from 6 countries that we analyze in our paper. I'll explain you why these countries. But it's from Canada, Czechia, the US, Slovakia, Spain, and Sweden. And we can see the blue dotted line, which is labor force participation, the ratio. And it's far below 1, which means 1 would be equal between men and women, right? And there's no equality in labor force participation. But the tertiary education ratio is above 1. So women have, bypassed men. And here, if you take the aggregate of these countries, this has happened in around 2005, but then it differs by country when exactly. But so today's young generation that are now entering the labor market grow up in a world where women outperform men in education. That wasn't necessarily the case for previous generations. So then, one implication of this is that young men today develop increasingly conservative attitudes on questions related to women's rights and their suitability to compete on the labor market, compared to previous generations of young men. So we compare both to older men today, but also to previous generations of young men. And this is what I think is the strength of this paper, is that we're going to have over time data, which we didn't have before. And that is what you really need if you want to make this generational claim. Then, today's older men do not particularly hold conservative attitudes on such questions compared to previous generations of older men. So we don't expect this to affect older men because they're not in the same labor market situation as young men are. So it's a generational effect, an age effect, and no period effect. We also think it's about attitudes that are related to gender and the labor market, but we don't expect a general backlash. So we hypothesize that young men today do not hold more conservative attitudes on gender equality and sexuality issues that are unrelated to increased gender competition on the labor market compared to young men of previous generations. And we also expect that they do not hold more conservative attitudes on the environment, just to broaden it a bit and show it's not a general conservatism. Then, and this is a hard test of our theory, we argue it's specific about women's labor market competition and not any outgroup labor market competition. You could think it's a time period where, the economy is doing poorly and then it's just about securing your job no matter against who. We argue it's about the competition with women and not with immigrants. And this is because immigrants face bureaucratic and language barriers that hinder their integration into the labor market, and also other cultural forms of discrimination that they face, that women do not face. And so gender discrimination with regard to the labor market, the entry-level labor market, should be much weaker than immigrants' discrimination in the labor market, including in entry-level jobs. Also, immigrant labor market competition is not new or unique to today's young generation, and it does not challenge a society's gender norms, which we believe is inherent to the understanding of society that people have, and also to young men's understanding of their own status in society. And so we don't think that immigrants' labor market competition constitute the same kind of perceived or sometimes realistic threat to young women on the entry-level labor market as women's competition does. And therefore, we hypothesize that women's labor market competition provokes more opposition among recent generations of young men than immigrants' labor market competition. And then finally, this is a bit of a different type of argument because we have longitudinal data to use this one. And so we follow the same people over time, and we can see what happens as the same person changes over time. And so we think that decreasing young men's vulnerability to labor market competition will make them develop more progressive gender attitudes, which guides us to the hypothesis that within the same young men, in recent generations, increases in education, income, or secure employment status will increase their support for gender equality. So these are our hypotheses. We have data for the first 4 hypotheses. We have cross-sectional data, but over time, from the World Value Survey, European Value Survey, and then we have several waves. And we have these 6 countries, which is purely data-driven. These are the countries with the questions that we need that are included for at least 2 waves over a time period of at least 15 years, because we want to see those changes. And I mean, luckily, in a way, these are countries that are quite varied in the regions that they cover in terms of, Eastern European, Northern European, Southern European, then we have the West, the US and Canada. So there's some variation there at least, which is interesting, I think. But there's no good theoretical rationale behind this selection. And then our N is between 21 and 33,000, depending on the dependent variable. Our dependent variables are the most interesting ones for our hypothesis are when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, and men make better business executives than women do. So these are really variables that hint at gender labor market competition. It's about how men and women do on the labor market in direct comparison. And then to test the other hypotheses, we have 2 questions on whether it's justifiable to be homosexual and justifiable to have an abortion. Then for environmentalism, protecting the environment should be given priority, even if it causes slower economic growth and some loss of jobs. And when jobs are scarce, natives should have more right to a job than immigrants. This is interesting because the wording is the exact same for the immigration one and for the women one, just that one is men versus women, and the other one is natives versus immigrants. And so you can really isolate the effect of which group it is. And we standardize all the dependent variables. And then for the final hypothesis, we have longitudinal data, so we track within individual changes. It's the LIS panel from the Netherlands using data from 2007 to 23. And the dependent variable, it's not perfect because it's not exactly about the labor market, but it's the best we have. It is unnatural for women to have control over men. And we recoded it to binary for agreement. We have 86,000 observations for more than 16,000 respondents over time. And here we focus only on those who were young, so according to our definition, between 18 and 29 years old, in the year 2007 when the panel started. And so we track them then, how do they develop as they grow older? Okay. Well, then we have quite a simple setup, really, because our independent variables are just gender and age in an interaction. So we have 4 categories, young versus older, and then women and men, and then, the intersection between the 2. We do APC analysis, age, period, cohort. We do them with and without controls. Some people argue you should do it without controls because there's nothing that influences your gender or your age, so you don't need a control variable, and there are no confounders. But then other people want to see them. And so we have them education, religious, left, right, married, income, country. The results hold either way. And we use survey weights. And then we do, for the 5th hypothesis, a fixed effect panel regression analysis with the longitudinal data. And here we have controls, whether they're married, left, right, or students. And none of these are, of course, causal analysis. So let's get to the results. These are all the results for hypothesis 1 to 4, basically. And so the first 2 panels show the variables that we are most interested in. When jobs are scarce, they should be given to men, and men make better business executives. And then what you see is the green dotted line are young men, and then the yellow line are old men. And then we have women, older women, the red line, and the blue dotted line are young women. And so we can see that with both of these items, the x-axis is time, right? So this is from 1994 to 2022, and this is from 2005 to 2022, just based on data availability. And then the blue line, the young women, they just consistently are least likely to agree with this statement. Not surprising. The older people, both men and women, on both questions, become more progressive over time. And there's a gender gap, but still both become more progressive over time, which is what we would expect, right? That as the newer generations become old, those people who are old have a bit more progressive values because the younger people tend to be more progressive than the older ones. But then here we have the young men. So those people who were young in the 90s, and then now the young men today. And we can see that young men today are more conservative on both questions, and to a stronger extent on the first one, than they were before. So this is in line with our hypotheses. Then we have the one on immigrants in direct comparison. And it's interesting because there are much fewer gender gaps, first of all, over time. And the older ones are a bit more conservative, but they become more progressive over time. We have a bit of a, peak, but then it goes down again around 2010 to 14. And then the women, the young women, they follow the same trajectory, but end up becoming more progressive again. And the young men follow a similar trajectory as well. They don't diverge as strongly as they do on the gender questions, but they do diverge a bit from young women. And the gender gap is larger among the young than it is among the old. So there is a similar tendency, but it's not as pronounced, which is in line with what we expect. Then for environmentalism, I mean, everyone just becomes, well, first a bit more progressive, then I guess this is the economic crisis, and then a bit more progressive again. Young women a bit more strongly than the others, but there's no indication that young men today are particularly more conservative. And then abortion, everybody becomes more progressive, including the young men, and homosexuality the same. So this is all in line with our hypothesis. Just to repeat, the hypothesis that young men today develop increasingly conservative attitudes on questions related to women's rights and suitability to compete on the labor market compared to previous generations of young men, and today's older men do not. They do not hold more conservative on attitudes on gender equality and sexuality that are unrelated to gender competition on the labor market. So these were abortion and homosexuality in our data, and also not on environmental protection. And women's competition provokes more opposition among young men than immigrants' competition. So all of that so far is confirmed or supported by the evidence. This is by country. And it shows that there are some country differences. So in the pooled analysis, it looks much neater. In the country analysis, not as much. So the trends aren't as clear in the US. They are in Canada, but we don't have data points here in between 2008 and 22. They are in Sweden. In Sweden, it's quite a clearer trend. And in Spain, this is the latest data point is from 2014. So if we expect, and we don't know that this line continues to go like this, and this line continues to go down, then it's even more of a trend. But otherwise, yeah, a bit cautious here. And then Czechia and Slovakia, we only have 2 data points. One is from the 90s, and one is from 2022. So also treated to be a bit with a bit of caution, but then the trends are pointing in similar directions as well. So in the pooled analysis, it looks much neater than in the country analysis. Something to be aware of. Then the final one, which I think is very interesting and a bit more complex. So this is just a cross-section of the data that we have before going into the over time analysis. So we have agreement with the statement that it is unnatural for women to have control over men. The red line are men, and then the blue line are women, and on the x-axis you have the age groups. And you see that the young men are most likely to agree that it is unnatural for women to have control over men, compared to older men and women of any age group. So that's already in line with what we expect. And then this graph shows how this changes if somebody acquires tertiary education or a full-time employment. So FTE is full-time employment that is either below the mean wage or then above the mean wage. And the triangles are young men and the circles are young women, just to compare. And so the first one here is, it shows that as a young man acquires tertiary education, he becomes less likely, to agree that it is unnatural for women to have control over men. So he becomes a bit more progressive. The same happens as a young man gets a full-time employment from unemployed to full-time employment below mean wage, and the effect is even stronger if this full-time employment has an above average wage. So this is in line with our hypothesis. For young women, we see either no effect for the first 2. For the third one, we see an effect. And I think it is because if a young woman goes from unemployment to full-time employment that is above wage, she is likely to have some control over a man in terms of she might have a leading position. And so she might also become less likely to agree that it is unnatural for a woman to have control over men, even though her baseline agreement was already much lower, as we can see here. Okay. So that then is in support of our fifth hypothesis. Within young men in recent generations, increases in education, income, or secure employment status increase support for gender equality. So we think that this contributes by explaining and nuancing the previous descriptive findings on young men's conservatism. It explains the differences between different variables that are found, and nuances why we find gender divide in some variables and not in others. It does not explain the cross-country variation that we can't really do. And I don't think anyone else has done it either, so if you have any ideas, that would be great. So our main argument then is that it's about perceived and or realistic vulnerability to gender labor market competition that explains young men's increasing conservatism. But what is also interesting is that it's not a general backlash. So it's not that they face this kind of competition or think that they might face it in the future, and that's why they become opposed to everything that has to do with feminism. That's not what we see. So far there seems to be no spillovers to items unrelated to competition, which I guess is good news. So I have a final reflection. Is it really then a realistic concern that they have? Because as we argue, women are outperforming men in education, that is true, and entry-level job markets are as gender equal as never before, that is true too. So we might just say, well, maybe they just have a concern that is, it's kind of true, and we can understand that, and we can deal with it, and it's a real threat and rational in a way. But then, if you think it through, it's not that rational, because we see that the lower educated men are the ones who perceive these threats most strongly. But the lower educated ones and also the lower income ones are the ones who are less likely to be competing against women on the labor market because of gender job segregation, and also because they're not competing for leading positions. So if gender quotas is what is threatening them, for instance, gender quotas are always put in place for leading positions. But if you are a lower educated, lower income man, you're most likely not competing for a leading position, or at least not yet. So you're not really facing the gender quota hurdle that might come at some point or for others. And if you work in a lower educated, typical men's job, then you're probably not competing against women as much. So even though there might be men, and there are men who will be facing a situation where it's about, am I getting the job or is a woman getting the job? And if there's a gender quota or an initiative by the company or so to advance women, then they might actually have a disadvantage. Most men, and especially the the lower educated and lower income ones, are probably not in that situation. And so then the question is it really a realistic threat, or is it a more general perception of a general threat, a perceived status threat, and not a direct economic threat? And then if it is a more general perceived status threat, that becomes much less tangible, difficult to tackle if we think of implications, policy recommendations perhaps, and probably also more likely to result in some kind of spillover to other indicators where we would also perhaps expect some backlash then, especially if we consider that social media also feeds these kind of notions, of course. So this is just a reflection, because I don't think that the very realistic threat thing is the whole story. But that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Gefjon. Quite interesting. We open the floor for questions now, and who has a question?
Sorry to go first. Hello, I'm Karen Celis. I loved your talk. Very clearly presented, extremely important data, and I think your analyses are extremely well built and underpinned. And I'm triggered by your last sentence. So in that way, it is good that I asked the first question. So you say, and I think that you're absolutely right to interpret this as a status threat. And there's no spillover to other gender issues like abortion and so on and so forth. Very interesting. So my question now is, would you go as far as interpret this as, okay, you say status threat? Would you dare to push it to a power threat and then link it to spillover effects to authoritarianism?
Should I go? Okay.
It's up to you, Gefjon. We can also take a couple of questions first, and then we go back to you. It's your decision.
I would like to respond first. Is that okay?
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, conceptually, status and power threat is similar, I think, depending on how you think about power and authoritarianism. So
power is a bit more interrelational than status. Status is about the self.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's how I would distinguish the two. Status is about the self. Power is more also power to, power over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't have the question myself, the answer either, but I just want to hear you dwell on this a bit.
Yeah. So in the paper, we do write about the threat to male dominance in labor markets. And male dominance, it does imply some power, but also status. And social dominance is important in authoritarianism. I mean, I'm going to self-promote, but we just, in this Cambridge element that we published, we look at the relationship between gender and sexuality norms and authoritarian attitudes, and there's a really strong relationship, and it's stronger than the relationship between authoritarian attitudes and other democratic attitudes even. And so we make a claim that this relationship is so strong, yet often overlooked when we talk about authoritarianism. So I think it is absolutely key that people who have those gender ideas about dominance of men over women tend to have very authoritarian attitudes, or relatively to other people, and the relationship is really strong. So yes, I think there is a clear link. But then, for what it translates into, like in our nowadays societies, I don't want to be too pessimistic, because we don't see, on whole, that young men are particularly more likely to vote for the radical right than men in the age group that is a bit more older. And yeah, I mean, things have to happen for those authoritarian attitudes to then translate into vote choice, of course. But there is a risk, and there's a tendency, and there's a relationship, yes. But what does it really mean? And do these young men, because they have these attitudes, also then, I'm not so sure. It's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. Really interesting and very rich analysis. So much data, which is terrific, but it's also a challenge because you explain these general patterns, but what is really going on at the country level? And you indeed showed some differences between the countries. So my first question would be like, what are your intuitive or careful intuitions to explain these differences? Like you pointed out, there's more going on. there's indeed the online influence, there's the manosphere, there are all kinds of, like masculinity cultures, this whole fitness idea, and there maybe this broader backlash literature on gender can be helpful. If you look at Judith Butler's latest book, Who's Afraid of Gender, in which she calls it a phantasm, like this, it's not real, so maybe this threat that these young men experiencing or think they are experiencing is not real, it's a fantasy. So if you tie the analysis more to this literature, I think that can be really, really interesting also to address exactly to these questions of power, but difficult. Very interesting, challenging, but difficult. And then I just have a question about, you had to work with the questions and the surveys that were available. But if I'm thinking about this idea that it's unnatural for women to have control over men, what do people think unnatural means, and what does control mean? I don't know if you have any answer or idea, like what the respondents, how they define that, because it can mean so many things, control. If somebody would pose me the question, I would like to, I think it's unnatural for everybody to control anyone, right? So, just food for thought.
Yeah. So for cross-country differences, it's a really tricky question. And this whole debate, I think, has been completely lost on this question. And it makes no sense. So in Sweden, the trends are quite strong, even on voting in Sweden, in South Korea as well. And it's like Sweden, South Korea, how? In Germany, very little. I don't know why. So the question is why? We have no idea. And I think what needs to be looked at is an interaction between what the labor market looks like. And here in Sweden, it's very interesting because we have really high gender equality comparatively, but also a really strong gender job segregation comparatively. And so it results in a situation where, for instance, you have a company like Volvo, where almost only men work, engineers, because most engineers in Sweden are men, more so than even in other countries. But it's also a very gender equal economy, and they want women also in leading positions. And so at the moment in Volvo, they're keeping open leading positions and waiting for a woman. And so all those men who are highly qualified are frustrated because there's an open job and they cannot apply for it. So even in Sweden, where you think, okay, people are generally very progressive, and those men are generally very progressive, and the labor markets are progressive, and the society is quite progressive, but still you have those moments that create a conflict because of how segregated then the job market is. And then, that is one intersection that needs to be looked at, I think. So what exactly are the labor market dynamics? But then also, how is gender politicized? And which issues are politicized by which parties? And that also differs a lot by countries. So in the UK at the moment, transgender rights are a huge thing. So if we had an item of transgender rights, maybe we would see something there. But that is, it's UK and it's happening now. And then in other places, it's other issues that come up. And in the US, suddenly it was abortion, kind of out of nowhere, but not. But the way it blew up, there were always mobilizations, but the way that it is now, well, maybe it was just me saying it's sudden, okay. But in other places, that is not politicized. So which issues are politicized and in what way are they threatening to young men, I think also needs to be looked at. And then this whole online world is another thing. It is an international thing, and young people are internationally active on social media, so I don't know how much it has the potential to explain cross-country differences. But there are also national actors, of course, and then maybe it's also about how familiar and how good people are at English. although in that age group many are. But so there are so many of those variables that it really requires in-depth analysis. And I'm on a team with a group of, I think, 8 people, where we try to group up and write a new element where each of us looks as one context in a coordinated way to try to do exactly that. Yeah. So this was long, I'm sorry. Judith Butler, yes, the threat is a fantasy. At least partly is a fantasy, because I do think the first part is still true. But partly, yes. Or also what they feel is threatened is also a kind of a fantasy, right? It is a construct, their position in society, right? It's not just their direct income or job that is threatened. So we should engage with that line of literature. And what does it mean? It's unnatural for women to control men. I also think it's unnatural for anyone to control anyone. I agree. It's the item that we had. I'm thinking we could maybe reach out to the list people and ask them if they have information. Because, when you test those survey questions, maybe you get information on more of what people actually associate with it. And that maybe that can help answering. Because I don't know. It is a bit of an odd item. I agree.
Okay, any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, you compared different countries. I don't understand why. Wouldn't the effect be more important if you compare, for example, rural versus urban environments? Mm. And also the effect of religious beliefs. You didn't talk about it.
Mm. We can definitely do that. It's among our control variables anyway, so we can have a look. So controlling for our control variables doesn't change the results, so it can't be about living in rural versus urban. That is not the explanation, or being religious or not, because it is controlled for and doesn't change the results. But of course we can still look at what the patterns look like in the different groups, and that would be very interesting, I agree. But I don't have the answer. But I agree, yeah.
Hi. You ready for the next question? Thank you. No, it was amazing data, as people have said. Really important topic. I don't do this kind of quantitative research, so apologies if the question doesn't make sense. But you sort of started out, your hypotheses were that people were quite rational, so that they had there were reasons, economic self-interest and issues about, basically economic self-interest. And then your conclusions were that actually they weren't rational at all. So then you've kind of got the question left, well, why do they perceive a threat to, you say, status, you could bring in power? And I'm kind of really keen to know more about that. And I wondered if you'd thought about the fact that there are discourses at play. You said, obviously, you mentioned at one point there's an economic crisis happening in certain parts of Europe, I assume more than others. But that was a big factor. But what about the kind of discourses and imaginaries around that? And I wondered if you'd thought about the fact that these individuals you're looking at are also part of a collective group. So presumably they're influencing each other as well. So I'd wondered if you thought about that. So they're not sort of just making they don't have these beliefs just because of their own personal perceptions. They have them because they're shared among their peers and the people that they're interacting with through social media and in the workplace. So I don't know if that was really a question, but it is a question. I'm not expecting you to have the answers, but I would be keen to hear you respond to that in some way. Thank you.
Thanks. How rational? There is a rational component to it. One, because women are outperforming men in education, and entry-level job markets are relatively gender equal today. And there is something to lose, but it's not as rational as you can say, they are economically losing in the sense that they will have less money or a worse job, for many of them at least. For some of them, that is even the case, I guess, but for most people, probably not. But there is a rational component to it. Also, if you think about it, that, you know, young men come from school and they know the young girls in their class, they always did better on average. And they come from university and they know the girls always did better on average. And probably the best in class was always a girl, most likely. And I mean, that's true in many cases. And so there is a rational part to it, I do think so. But the thing is that what is threatened is maybe not the really tangible economic thing, but something a bit more symbolic as well. Which I don't think it makes it super irrational. It just makes it, less. It's less this hard economic thing maybe. And then the group, I mean, and that's true. I mean, of course, peer groups are super gendered growing up, and that will have a big influence. What I can say is we did focus groups, and I didn't analyze them yet, not systematically, but we have groups in 5 countries, one with only men, one with only women, and then one with that is gender mixed. So 3 groups in each country. And we have them talk about gender equality, basically, and they're all young people. And we are quite surprised that we don't really find... We thought maybe the young men among each other, you know, they start and then they become anti-gender equality, basically, and we don't really find that so much. There are some examples of single men in those groups who have those views, but not so much. And that we don't, at least in this very controlled focus group setting of people who don't know each other before, that dynamic doesn't take off, which is good news, I guess. But then, there's also social media and so on. But if there was a lot of this collective reinforcement of this grievance or status threat or what you want to call it, then I think we would see more of a general trend across several indicators related to feminism and we don't really see that. So I'm not sure how strong that dynamic really is.
Hi, Gefjon. I hope you feel better soon, because this was already such an amazing presentation and really interesting stuff. So I can only imagine if you would be 100% on top of things, but really excellently done. So you can take a breather as well, because many interesting questions, challenging as well. I had, like Lisa, a similar question about the question and the phrasing in the Netherlands, which if you ask about controlling other people and you would put that question in front of an audience like this one with tertiary education, higher educated, we would all simply not not gonna have that. So whilst listening to you, first came my gut reaction, like how much of a desirability bias is there in the data, where you find that the higher educated men, once they attain higher education, they become more likely to say, well, this is can be natural for women to control others, but then so they are kind of talking to the researcher and thinking, well, there's a social norm of gender inclusivity, so I'll just conform and say yes, it can be possible. But if you then think about how awkwardly phrased that question is, you would also expect them to completely reject the question. So there's something going on there that I think is worthy of unpacking further. And so perhaps in the data there may be some angry responses from respondents. Sometimes they do kick back and send you emails saying, I want to file a complaint because I'm not happy with this phrasing, it's biased. So that might be really interesting. And then I had a very broad question. In all the graphs that you displayed, there's attention to women, but of course this story is about men. Is there something more to unpack about the trends you see among women? because in my social environment, I can also see that some young girls, students of mine, are becoming more okayish with more gender conservative values and saying, well, perhaps if there's job scarcity, it should go to the male breadwinner and not to them. So I was wondering if there's more that you can tell us about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I like the idea of social desirability and the social context that comes with education and how that has an effect. And there are studies that came out quite recently showing that the field of education influences your political attitudes via the social context that you find yourself in. So not just the level of education, but also the field. Yeah, and the social desirability. I mean, I guess the other two variables, full-time employment, are less subject to that, at least. So that helps our argument. But I find it very interesting still, the social desirability one. And yeah, we should ask the LIS people if they ever came across something. And then what about young women? Yeah, so young women, sometimes there's something, I don't have it here, but in some of our, and on some of our findings, so for instance, now we're writing a paper where we actually try to get at social media effects, and we were expecting a bubble effect where young men and women diverge because they find themselves in different bubbles in social media, and we don't find that. We find that young men become more conservative in certain contexts on social media, and young women, not so much, no movement, or even also a bit more conservative if they spend a lot of time on social media. A small effect, but still. And then among some of the other analyses that are using more socioeconomic factors and contextual factors, there are some findings where we see a slight tendency sometimes among young women. It's a very small effect sometimes, but yeah, so often we don't see that young women are particularly more progressive than older women. Which might also be because of some baseline effects, because it's a low level anyways. But sometimes there is something, and we haven't looked into it. And I can see what you're saying, that there might be something like that. Yeah. And maybe there is a social media thing to it too, because social media is super gendered and also gender conservative in many ways, actually, also for women and how women portray themselves. And so yeah, maybe. It's very interesting, but we haven't looked into it.
Me again. It's really interesting that you mentioned that you have focus groups and that they come after the survey data. So I think that a lot of answers can be found in your focus groups analysis. So that's great. And one of the things that, because you said, related to the question, is there a real threat, or is it a fantasy that is constructed also online, and there are political entrepreneurs that promote it, and so forth. We know that literature. So you mentioned, okay, but there's an objective threat. These young boys see that women outperform them in class, at universities, and so on and so forth. But they also see this in a context of male dominance. So women outperform men, girls outperform men, but men are still heads of schools. They are the CEOs. The face of power is still to a great extent male dominant, and there might be some equality and so on and so forth, but still, it's not the outperforming that is that travels to positions of power, also in a school context, also in a university context. Yeah. So, and I think that the focus groups are brilliant for testing, like, is there a real threat that they, how do they understand the threat, and is there then also some objective reality behind their claims about the threat?
Yeah, there is an argument, and I think it is Jessica Fortin-Rittenberger who made it, but I'm not exactly sure. It's not my argument, but that it's a bit about generational comparison in a way that young men today see that they're not going to do as well as their fathers or grandfathers relative to how they did to women in their generation. And young women today do better than their mothers and grandmothers relative to how they did, compared to how they did it relative to men in their generations. And so I wonder if it's also some projection on future projection, basically. So if I am now in school as a young man and the young women are doing better, sure, now we have a head of school who's a man, but I'm sure in 20 years it will be a woman, or whatever, or maybe in 5 years, or what, I don't know, but yeah, the focus groups will help looking at that. But yeah, it just made me think about this relative generational argument and the projection of where you stand and might stand, and your reference, which are often our parents, of course, or the parents' generation. But yeah, the focus groups might help, hopefully.
I actually have a question myself as well. Okay, Audrey first.
Thank you, Gefjon. I was wondering, since you rely on big data sets, to what extent you could maybe find those data sets, those items on relations between group and how groups are, or they perceive their own group in society. Like the items are like, people like me are disadvantaged in society, or it's like intergroup fairness, so it depends how it's labeled. But those batteries of items do mostly exist in international surveys, and I could maybe explain or, I don't know, give you more insights into how they perceive their group to be advantaged or not in society. Of course, the group is not defined, so there you would infer that their group is then the men, or maybe they perceive their group as something else, but I mean, maybe this could be interesting. Or maybe it's something that's going to pop up in the focus group that they perceive, because this is to me a direct measure of feeling disadvantage or feeling that there is something unfair in society on my group in general. So that could be maybe something. At least in the Belgian version of the list, we do have this item. So it's, I guess it's in the list as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking it might be in the list. Yeah. No, this is really good. I don't think it's in the World Value Survey, but maybe I should look. Yeah, no, I agree. This would be a great item. Thank you, yeah.
Any others? Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very illuminating. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on this trend, and I wanted to ask you if you ever thought of looking at the interaction between the attitudes of the young men and the attitudes of the young women to see if there is some kind of reinforcing cycle going on there. As, I don't know, young women become more exposed to feminist thought, then the young men perceive that their peers are also becoming more extremist and that the society is becoming more disadvantageous to them, also because of the attitudes that they have in their peers. And I'm thinking about this because of a whole kind of like discourse that started to rise in the US right now about this, what they call the great feminization theory, which kind of collapses the whole entrance of women in the labor market onto whatever is understood as wokeness. So this kind of like, opposition to any type of anti-discrimination laws because it's understood as disadvantageous to men in general, and the understanding of women's advent in the labor market as socially engineered. And so that's where you could maybe find that the type of effect, but just wanted to know if you thought about doing that.
Yeah. I mean, maybe in the focus groups there's some of that dynamic in the gender mixed ones. That would be cool. Well, I don't know. It would be interesting. What we do see is, depending on how you ask survey items on gender equality, so here, a lot of the items, or some of the items look like this, where young women are not particularly progressive compared to older women, but also we already have a very low level of agreement, so there you can't go much lower. And young men are the ones who are more conservative. But then, on other questions, so if you ask whether women's discrimination is still a problem in society, you see the reverse pattern where young women are more progressive than older women. So they are more likely to agree that women's discrimination is still a problem. And young men aren't particularly conservative. They are more, there's more like a straight line for men than across age groups. So depending on how you ask a question related to gender equality, you can have those patterns that are either like this or flipped. So maybe it just makes me think that maybe it's true that, yeah, what you say, that, you know, young women have those progressive attitudes and young men have those conservative attitudes, and it might, yeah, speak to each other or reinforce this dynamic. Because, yeah, it does show like that on these indicators. But of course, we don't model the interaction between the two, so I cannot show that. But yeah, maybe in the focus groups we could look at that. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you. Congratulations for your wonderful talk. I appreciate. As man and as African, I'm very balanced between your arguments. So I have two questions about methodology. First, how did you choose the countries you study? And second, also, how did you choose the members of your focus group? Because I think so, if it mix, how you mix it, so you have the international trend, so having these other countries outside the one you studied. So. Thank you.
So the countries are, that's a limitation. They are chosen based on data availability. And so these are the countries for which we have the variables that we're interested in over time, over a reasonably long time period to assess generational differences and at least two data points. And that is the only reason why. I wish we had more. But I don't have a theoretical rationale for this. And I don't want to construct one because it's not true. So that's a poor answer, I'm afraid. And for the focus groups, there are also limitations. So the countries are Sweden, Germany, Poland, Greece, and Spain. And that is driven by money because it's funded by the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, and then it's based on which country office is interested. So no theoretical rationale. And then the focus groups are usually done in a bigger city. So in Germany it was in Berlin, and in Sweden it was in Stockholm, and I'm not sure about the other places. It will be similar. And so the people are usually from around that area. They try to diversify this and get people from surroundings of the cities at least. But yeah, you have a bias. So for instance, in the Berlin focus groups that I watched, several of those focus groups had only people with a migration background, which is in Berlin completely normal. In other places in Germany, it would look a bit different. So yeah, there will be biases based on the place where they chose these people, mostly, I think.
Thank you. Could you also please give a bit more detail about what kind of attitudes are measured or observed when you talk about progressive or on the contrary, conservative attitudes. What are these attitudes that you measure?
What do you mean?
Well, you talk about an attitude. What is behind this attitude?
Hmm.
What is it observed? No, I don't know how you do it, but what are the attitudes that are observed? I don't know how to say it differently.
I mean, is it a survey methodology question, basically? I mean, the attitudes are these items, right? I mean, we ask them to, in a quantitative way, on a scale, express how much they agree with these statements.
Okay, that's what you mentioned. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what we can do with survey methods in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but maybe it was something else behind it.
Yeah, I mean, there might be something behind, of course. But, I mean, there are methods to get at whether they are underlying more like latent attitudes or factors that would explain why people answer the way that they do. And those are analyses that we can run, of course. But we treat them separately because, and I think that is our theory, and it also is what we show. People do distinguish between the different items and answer to them in different ways. And it seems to be driven by different attitudes, which is part of our argument, or different concerns, if you want to say so. But
Okay.
yeah.
Any other questions? So I had one, Gefjon.
Yeah.
Just want to echo what has been said. I think it's really fascinating what you're doing. It's really great. So thank you also for joining us. My question was actually, so just going to check it. Yeah. So actually, I was wondering whether you were thinking of disentangling a bit more the aspect of education on the one hand, and then the other aspect of labor market participation and economic power. Because when you present the argument, you bring the two together, also in your theoretical framework, in how you build your hypothesis, also in even your last slide, you see them as linked, and they're obviously linked, but you don't really distinguish between them. And actually, when you started talking in the beginning, I thought, well, this is going to be an education story. I mean, but then I see why you went to labor market participation, because obviously the dependent variable links to that. But for me, there's an educational aspect that is is there, especially when you talk about threats. I think it's also education. And especially because also when you think about it, well, like the big changes that happened recently are the fact that women became much more present in tertiary education rather than women entering the workplace or the workforce, let's say, because that happened several decades ago already.
Yeah.
So whether it would be useful to look at these two things separately, because also what Karen was saying, like, okay, men are indeed the CEO, so like the power is gendered, but it's also very much linked to educational differences. It's education based as well, especially higher education versus other types of education. So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, it's true. And I mean, we have education in here. It's the people who think schools are unfair. I mean, public institutions, and then especially schools. And also here, it's young men residing in regions where women more strongly outperform men in terms of education. I really think education is important. What is interesting with education is that there's no zero-sum game. Even if a girl is best of the class, a boy could be equally good as her. They could be best of the class together. They could have the same points or marks or whatever you want to give them. So sure, there's competition, but it's not that there's only one job to get and one person will get it or not. And education is kind of it's all about, what, or at least when you're in high school or so, or at university, it's all about what will I do later. It's always the question that you get, right? So education is meant to prepare you for the labor market and for life, I guess. But still, a lot is about the labor market, and you go home to those family gatherings, and so it's like, what are you going to do later, kid? And so I think they are very closely linked, but I think education is why or a big part of why we're seeing what we're seeing. And if the educational situation wasn't the way it was, I don't think the labor market alone would drive these results. And it's probably because education is meant to prepare you for the labor market, I think. And that's also how people talk about it. That's how I would say it. But yeah, I mean, it would be cool to make that distinction clear, both theoretically and maybe even empirically if we can. But yeah, education doesn't have the competition. It does have a competition, but there's no way that only one person can have good marks. Everyone can have good marks if they're good. So that's also special about education in a way.
But it does bring the status aspect into it.
And
Like the status, like the last slide you said, but that's, I think, more linked to education than to your profession even in society today.
Especially for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, your marks are important. That's true. Yeah. Yeah, we can do much more with this. Yeah, disentangling them too. Yeah. Thank you.
And then perhaps one final
Yeah.
for me at least. There's still room for others. Can you? And it's a very it's a question about speculation. So I don't. If you're not willing to answer that, that's totally fine. But can you, based on this, speculate about what it means for the radical right gender gap in voting?
Oh. I mean, for voting for the radical right, I could see how there would be a relationship between having those attitudes that young men have, on average a bit more, and voting for and voting for the radical right. I can see how that would at some point translate into it under some certain circumstances. On average, it doesn't seem to translate into it yet. It does translate, or I don't know if this is what translates into it, but we do see that young men have a higher probability to say that they would ever consider voting for the radical right. But it might also be driven by normalization of the radical right, for instance, and we don't know if it's this what drives this. But the gender gap, yeah, I mean, it could. The radical right would probably be in favor of restoring or maintaining some male status or dominance, privately or publicly.
Because in some countries we've seen that it's narrowing the radical right gender gap, but it might be increasing again for younger generations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so in France, for instance, the arguments that is, because France is one of those countries where there was no gender gap in the late 10s. I think it might be back, I'm not sure. But did somebody know? No. But anyway, so in France it decreased. And then the argument was that it was about Marine Le Pen who made this argument about being a modern woman as well. And so it's a more of a substantive representation of women argument rather than, because men are represented anyways. So the question is more like, how do you win the women voters? But this kind of argumentation would rather deter the women voters, I guess. So if they would just go by what they're already doing, then that would maintain a gender gap at least, yeah.
One more question still.
Sorry.
Me again. If you get sick and tired of me, just say so. Again, your focus groups, you see I'm a big fan of qualitative research and especially focus groups, will also help you to unpack another crucial assumption. And that is, my question is now triggered by your question, Sylvia, and that is about status at school. You assume, but I think that this is our generation. So you assume that having high grades is actually linked to status. I was one of these girls with high grades. I did not have any status at all.
Same here.
Actually, my high grades reduced my status because I was a sut in Dutch. I don't know what it's in English. Status at school was about
being cool,
being beautiful, being cool, wearing the right clothes, the sports club, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure that this is still today, because we were laughing. It's about the girls. It's about like the kind of nails that you wear, and you know these. So I think like that your focus groups will also be like a terrific moment where you can unpack status and how this is then linked to projections into the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I agree. I mean, to be cool at school, you really don't want good grades. Same. But to get the recognition of your parents, you do want them. So it's two different things. But yeah. Yeah. It's a good point. Yeah.
Any other questions? Any other questions?
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. Obviously, it raises many questions. I have one more general question. Do you think that these anti-feminist attitudes might be changing in their nature? That today anti-feminism is maybe changing their forms, taking on new forms? And that is question, and I also have just a short comment. It seems to me that even though these are sometimes irrational attitudes, not grounded in reality, maybe that is often common feature of conservative views, like to be irrational, like for example in the case of homophobia. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, anti-feminism is changing in its nature, yes, of course, and also across population groups. I think being anti-feminist means different things, and it has different motivations. And so I think what we get perhaps closest to with our items, well, I don't really know, but for instance, the ones that we use here, advancing women's and girls' rights has gone too far because it threatens men's and boys' opportunities. In this article, we argue it's modern sexism. It's not perfectly modern sexism, but the idea of modern sexism is that, of course, I am in favor of gender equality, but we already have it, so we don't need anything else. And anything else is too much, right? And then you can either think that we already had it 10 years ago and it's long been too much, or we have it now, so we don't need anything more. But this idea of modern sexism, and the motivation to be against feminism is a very different one, because you do still say that you believe in some kind of gender equality. You just don't see that there isn't gender equality. But there are people who don't believe in gender equality, right? And that might be for religious reasons, perhaps, or conservative reasons, or nationalist reasons, or authoritarian reasons, or I mean, there are many different ways to motivate that, but these are all different types of anti-feminism that we would expect to find in different population groups. And I mean, looking at abortion attitudes, where do we have them? Abortion. Or let's take homosexuality. We see that older people, sure, they become more progressive as well over time, but they're still less progressive than the younger people. And this is the kind of anti-feminism that I would expect among older people, right? It might be more religious motivated, whereas among young people, I don't expect religious, or not much at least, religious motivated anti-feminism. So yeah, it is differently motivated across different age groups and over time, and other kinds of population groups. And then irrational as a motivation, or irrational reasons as a motivation for conservatism, yes. But then I do find very intriguing still that we don't find a general conservatism, and that is what I find so interesting. And so I don't want to say it's purely just this irrational conservative, or it doesn't have to be irrational, but just conservative mindset that drives this, because it's more nuanced than that.
Anyone else? No, I think that's it, Gefjon. Thank you so much again for being here today and for your wonderful presentation and for the Q&A, everybody, of course. Next week, we're back on Thursdays. So let's meet next week. Then. Bye.
Thank you so much.